3. Vlad, the man behind a dark legend. The person we will discuss in this documentary is one of the most misunderstood figures in history. Some remember him as a monster, while others remember him as a ruler who considered any means necessary to protect his country. In the Western world, he is the inspiration for the Dracula legend. In Eastern European history, he is the harsh leader of a small voivodeship caught between Ottoman and Hungarian pressure. Today, we will try to understand Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, away from the noise of legends and within the realities of his time. Imagine 15th century Europe. Maps are constantly changing. Thrones change hands through bloodshed. In this era of weak central authority, power survives more through fear than mercy. Vlad's story begins in precisely such a world. Vlad was born in 1431 in the city of Sighisoara, Transylvania. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was the voivode of Wallachia. The nickname Dracula came from the Order of the Dragon, founded to defend Christianity. However, over time, this word also acquired the connotation of devil in Romanian. Vlad III inherited this nickname Dracula, meaning son of Dracul. Vlad's childhood was not an innocent period spent in the safety of the palace. On the contrary, he was introduced to politics at a very early age. While his father tried to maintain a balance between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, Vlad and his brother Radu were sent to the Ottoman palace as hostages. This was not an unusual situation in the diplomacy of the time. However, it was extremely traumatic for a child. These years spent in Edirne deeply affected Vlad's character. He received a good education at the Ottoman palace. He learned Turkish, became familiar with the art of war, and saw what discipline meant. But at the same time, he was deprived of his freedom. He and his brother were paying the price for their father's political mistakes. While his brother Radu adapted to this environment, a growing sense of anger and vengeance took root within Vlad. By 1447, Vlad's life changed irrevocably. His father, Vlad II Dracula, and his brother Mircea were brutally murdered during a rebellion in Wallachia. Mircea's eyes had been gouged out, and he had been buried alive. This event was etched into Vlad's mind. Power was no longer just a right to rule in his eyes. It was the only way to survive. Vlad first ascended the Wallachian throne in 1448 with Ottoman support. However, this reign lasted only a few months. He was deposed by Hungarian-aligned boyars. The following years were a period of exile, escape, and constant vigilance for Vlad, until 1456. In 1456, Vlad regained the throne of Wallachia, this time with Hungarian support. This is precisely when the legend of Vlad the Impaler truly began. When he ascended the throne, Wallachia was in a state of internal decay. The boyars were constantly betraying him, the people were crushed under heavy taxes, and the country was being ravaged by Ottoman raids. Vlad responded to this chaos with one method: absolute fear. Impalement was a method of execution known even before Vlad. However, it was Vlad who turned it into a systematic, symbolic, and political weapon. Guilty or innocent, thief or noble. For Vlad, anyone who disrupted order could share the same fate. According to legend, a golden cup stood in the middle of the square in Wallachia, and no one dared to steal it, because the punishment was clear. Viewed from today's perspective, these methods seem like unimaginable savagery. However, the reality of the 15th century was much darker. Vlad's goal was not arbitrary cruelty, but to make his authority absolute. Fear was his law. Vlad's relations with the Ottomans completely broke down during this period. He refused to pay the tax he owed to Mehmed the Conqueror, and rumors spread that he had impaled Ottoman envoys. This was an open challenge. In 1462, Mehmed the Conqueror marched on Wallachia with a large army. The conflicts between the two sides were more psychological warfare than conventional battles. Vlad wore down the Ottoman army with night raids. The most famous incident was the Forest of Stakes he erected near Târgoviște. According to legend, thousands of Ottoman soldiers were impaled on stakes, and even Mehmed the Conqueror was said to have been affected by the sight. However, despite all this resistance, Vlad did not win the war. He lost his throne and was forced to seek refuge in Hungary. He lived there in captivity for years. Interestingly, Vlad's image as a monster was shaped during this period by pamphlets circulating in Western Europe. These texts, printed in German printing houses, portrayed Vlad as a bloodthirsty tyrant. However, most of these narratives were political propaganda. The same Vlad was seen as a hero resisting the Ottomans in Eastern Europe. History, as always, was shaped by who told it. Vlad ascended the throne of Wallachia for the last time in 1476. However, his reign was very short-lived. He was killed in battle that same year. The exact manner of his death is unknown. The only thing that is certain is that his head was cut off and sent to Istanbul, where it was presented to Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. Vlad the Impaler died, but his story did not. Centuries later, he was transformed into Dracula by Bram Stoker's pen. Although there is no direct link between the real Vlad and the literary Dracula, the name and fame merged to become an immortal myth. When we look at Vlad today, we must ask the question, was he a monster or a product of his time? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Vlad played by the rules of the world he lived in an era where mercy was considered weakness and fear was considered strength. He made others pay the price for his survival. In the rest of this documentary, we will examine in detail why Vlad Tepes was sent as a prisoner to the Ottomans, how his years in Edirne shaped his character, his tense relationship with Mehmed the Conqueror, and how all of this laid the foundation for the Vlad legend. The road to the Ottoman palace, the reason for his captivity. Vlad the Impaler's captivity by the Ottomans was not a personal punishment. It was a natural consequence of the ruthless diplomacy of the time. In the 15th century, small principalities and voivodeships had to offer guarantees to survive between the great powers. Wallachia was one of these squeezed territories. Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula, declared allegiance to Ottoman Sultan Murad II on the one hand, while maintaining secret contacts with the Kingdom of Hungary and the Pope on the other. Although this dual policy allowed him to keep his throne in the short term, it led to him being seen as an unreliable ally in the eyes of the Ottomans. In 1442, the Ottomans summoned Vlad II Dracula to Edirne. This invitation was ostensibly friendly, but in reality, it was a show of force. Dracula was released, but his two sons, Vlad and Radu, were held hostage in the Ottoman palace. This was a clear message: remain loyal, and your sons will live. Vlad was about 11 years old at the time. He was torn from his family at a young age, and his fate was left to the cold stone walls of imperial politics. The Edirne years, two brothers, two different paths. Under the same roof, Vlad and Radu were not locked in a dungeon in the Ottoman palace. On the contrary, they received one of the best educations of the time: language, mathematics, war strategy, and court etiquette. They were taught everything, but they had no freedom. Every step, every breath was a reminder. They were hostages. His brother Radu adapted to this life. He embraced Ottoman culture, converted to Islam, and in later years became a pro-Ottoman figure. Vlad, on the other hand, withdrew into himself. He learned discipline, but did not embrace it. He saw obedience, but did not internalize it. According to some historians, Vlad observed methods of punishment in the Ottoman palace, particularly exemplary executions. The origins of the methods he later applied in Wallachia bear the traces of these observations. Fatih Sultan Mehmed and Vlad, an inevitable encounter, not a direct one. During Vlad's years in Edirne, Fatih Sultan Mehmed was still a young prince. It is often suggested that they were in the same city and may even have seen each other. However, there is no reliable evidence that they had a direct friendship or closeness. Nevertheless, the fates of these two figures would inevitably intersect in the future. Fatih was a rational ruler who acted with the goal of expanding an empire. Vlad, on the other hand, was a border leader who built his independence on fear. In 1461, Vlad refused to pay the annual tribute he owed to the Ottomans. This was not merely an economic decision, it was an open challenge declaring his refusal to recognize Ottoman sovereignty. Moreover, his harsh treatment of Ottoman envoys during this period created an irreversible rupture. The 1462 campaign, fear clashes with fear. Fatih Sultan Mehmed responded to Vlad's rebellion with a major campaign. When the Ottoman army entered Wallachian territory, it did not encounter the usual battle formation. Vlad was retreating, burning villages, and wearing down the army with night raids. And then came that famous scene near Targovishte, a field stretching for miles, lined with stakes. This was more of a psychological message than a military victory. Vlad was telling his enemy, "I rule these lands." According to legend, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror was not horrified by this sight, but he was not impressed either. With cold-blooded realism, he withdrew and chose to replace Vlad with his brother Radu, a more manageable figure, an emperor and a voivode. For Mehmed the Conqueror, Vlad was an uncontrollable ally. For Vlad, Mehmed represented the absolute power that had been synonymous with his childhood captivity. This relationship was less a personal enmity than a clash between two different conceptions of power. Vlad's anger towards the Ottomans was not merely political. It was the sum of his childhood freedom taken away, his family's death, and a constant feeling of humiliation. That is why, to understand Vlad the Impaler, one must look not only at the atrocities he committed, but also at the process that led him to this point. Because Vlad was first a prisoner, then a ruler, finally a legend. The birth of propaganda, a ruler's transformation into a monster. Vlad the Impaler's historical fame was shaped more by what was written about him than by his actions. Brochures printed in Hungary and German principalities, in particular, portrayed Vlad as a dehumanized tyrant. During this period, when the printing press was just beginning to spread across Europe, the texts produced about Vlad were akin to early media campaigns. In these pamphlets, Vlad was depicted as a figure who impaled children, ate human flesh, and bathed in blood. The exaggeration was obvious, but the goal was clear: to discredit this voivode who was acting independently against the Ottomans and had broken away from Hungarian control. Interestingly, during the same period, Vlad was portrayed in the oral narratives of Wallachian peasants as a ruler who applied justice harshly, but equally. Thieves suffered, as did nobles. A monster in the west, a bringer of order in the east, the road to Dracula. From name to myth, by the time Bram Stoker published his novel Dracula in 1897, Vlad the Impaler had long since faded from the pages of history. Stoker had little deep historical knowledge of Vlad. However, the name was powerful. Dracula, son of the devil, a ruler associated with blood, an ideal foundation for a legend. With the novel, Vlad was stripped of his historical identity and transformed into an immortal vampire. This transformation irrevocably altered Vlad's perception in the Western world. He was no longer a real ruler. He was a figure of fear who rose from his grave at night. Death and silence. In 1476, Vlad ascended the throne of Wallachia for the third time. However, this return was more of an end than a victory. He was killed in battle that same year. Some sources say he died fighting Ottoman soldiers, while others say he was killed by his own men who did not recognize him. According to the most widely accepted account, Vlad's head was cut off and sent to Istanbul. This was both proof of his death and a political message. For Mehmed the Conqueror, it signaled the end of instability on the border. The location of Vlad's body remains unknown. He has no grave, but he has a story. Final word, a reflection of an era. It would be incomplete to remember Vlad the Impaler only for his stakes, blood, and fear. He was a reflection of the era in which he lived. In a world where power trumped mercy, he was a ruler who made the price of survival heavy. His relationship with Mehmed the Conqueror was not one of personal hatred. It was a clash between two different state mindsets. One represented the imperial order, the other, the independence of borders. When we look at Vlad today, we must ask ourselves the real question. Did we make him a monster, or did he fulfill the demands of his era? Because some legends are born where truth is silent. Silent witnesses, sources, contradictions, and gaps in history. Much of what we know about Vlad the Impaler is based on biased sources. Ottoman chronicles, Hungarian records, and German pamphlets. Each was written from its own political perspective. This makes it difficult to see Vlad's true character with clear lines. In Ottoman sources, Vlad is mostly referred to as the rebellious voivode. He is harsh, unreliable, but not portrayed as an extraordinary threat. These narratives are written with state logic rather than emotion. In contrast, German sources, especially those written by Saxon merchants, demonize Vlad. The reason is clear. Vlad restricted the Saxons' commercial privileges, taxed them, and sometimes imposed harsh penalties. Where economic interests were harmed, the narrative hardened. Hungarian accounts, however, are more ambivalent. Vlad is sometimes seen as a shield against the Ottomans, sometimes as an uncontrollable threat. The same person was both supported and imprisoned during the same period. The historian's task is to navigate these contradictions and notice the silent gaps. Vlad's true story is perhaps best hidden in these gaps. Can fear be a management tool? The violence Vlad the Impaler employed was not random. It was systematic. It was based on deterrence. In this respect, Vlad was not entirely disconnected from his contemporaries. In medieval Europe, executions were carried out in public and bodies were used as messengers. Vlad's difference was that he took this method to extremes. However, this extremism yielded results in the short term. The crime rate in Wallachia fell, and central authority strengthened. This fact does not justify Vlad's methods, but it allows us to understand his logic. Judged by today's values, Vlad was a tyrant. Judged by the values of his own time, he was a harsh but effective border administrator. Fatih Sultan Mehmed's perspective. From Fatih Sultan Mehmed's point of view, Vlad the Impaler was not a personal issue. He was an element that disrupted stability on the Ottoman border. A voivode who refused to pay taxes, humiliated envoys, and constantly set the region ablaze. Fatih's decisions regarding Vlad were strategic, not emotional. Instead of eliminating him directly, it was preferred to replace him with a more compliant figure. This choice is a typical example of imperial politics. At this point, the difference between Vlad and Fatih becomes clear. Vlad ruled through fear. Fatih ruled through order. The man behind the legend, the story of Vlad the Impaler, is also the story of how power transforms a person. A prince taken hostage at a young age turned fear into his only weapon as an adult. It is easy to remember him only for his cruelty. What is difficult is to understand how he got to this point. Perhaps what makes Vlad immortal is not the stakes, but the disturbing questions he leaves behind. The spirit of the times, surviving in the 15th century. Perhaps the most critical key to understanding Vlad the Impaler is to correctly interpret the century in which he lived. The 15th century was a period of transition for Europe, the end of the Middle Ages, the threshold of the modern age. But this threshold brought destruction as much as progress. Centralized states had not yet fully taken root. It was not rules that spoke between kings, princes, and feudal lords, but power. The law may have been written, but its enforcement was possible only by the sword. In such a world, a small region like Wallachia, located on the border, had to either become harsh or perish. Vlad's harshness, in this context, can be interpreted not as a choice, but as a defensive reflex. The people of Wallachia and Vlad's legacy today, Vlad the Impaler, remains a controversial figure in Romania. Some see him as a national hero. He is remembered as a leader who resisted the Ottomans and established eternal order. For others, Vlad is a tyrant who terrorized his country. However, both views agree that Vlad was no ordinary ruler. In the memory of the Wallachian people, Vlad symbolizes a period when justice was harsh but equal. The idea of the same punishment for everyone created a sense of security, especially for the lower classes. Vlad and the psychology of fear from a modern psychological perspective, Vlad the Impaler's behavior can also be interpreted as the defense reflexes of an individual who grew up under constant threat. A leader who was taken hostage as a child, brutally lost his family, and constantly witnessed betrayal. For Vlad, mercy was synonymous with weakness, because he had paid the price for mercy in his childhood. Therefore, throughout his reign, he consciously turned fear into a language. The stakes were not just a method of execution, they were Vlad's only clear answer to the world. The Ottoman perception of Vlad for the Ottoman ruling elite, Vlad was less a demonic figure and more an unpredictable actor. The problem was not his harshness, but his uncontrollability. In Ottoman politics, border regions were held together by loyalty. Vlad, however, chose fear over loyalty. This was not an acceptable model for the imperial order. Therefore, Vlad's removal was not an act of revenge. It was an operation to restore stability. Radu and Vlad, same beginning, opposite endings. Vlad's brother Radu grew up in the same palace and received the same education. However, the two brothers produced very different results from the same circumstances. Radu adapted. Vlad resisted. For the Ottomans, Radu was a ruler with whom they could cooperate. Vlad, on the other hand, was a constant source of risk. This choice determined the course of Wallachian history. Final sentence. History tells the story of the victors. Vlad the Impaler was not one of the victors. But his voice still echoes centuries later. A life that began as a prisoner took shape as a ruler and ended as a legend. And perhaps that is why understanding Vlad the Impaler means understanding not just a man, but an era. What Vlad the Impaler left behind is not just fear, it is a question. Does power protect man? or does it only make him more